everyone, and welcome to another episode of Science News. Today, I want to talk about an aspect of mental health that people are often uncomfortable talking about, despite how common it is. I'm talking about depression and its link to premature death as indicated by a new research paper. The research that was studied for the paper was conducted over more than half a century and involved more than 3,400 adults from southeastern Canada. To get into the details of their findings, the researchers described seeing a strong link between depression and mortality risk. This mortality risk is basically the statistically quantified risk of death given certain variables, like the time spent in a state of depression, the age and gender and ethnicity of the person who's depressed, as well as modifiers like diet, exercise, social activity, and employment, among many other variables. Variables like poor diet and smoking can lead to death on their own, and when combined with depression, which they're associated with depression, the risk of death is increased. Depression is also associated with death because of the physiological symptoms, including inflammation and cardiovascular suppression. Perhaps the most tragic and most identifiable cause of mortality associated with depression is suicide, which is committed mostly by young adults and adults of working age. The researchers found that this mortality risk was highly elevated in the time immediately following a depressive episode, which basically means that if you spend a month depressed with poor sleep, minimal eating, lethargy, and emotional depression, your risk of death will greatly increase. This risk will slowly decay as time goes on after the depressive episode, but if the individual experiences a successive depressive episode shortly afterward, that risk generally stays pretty high. The authors conclude their research paper by making note of two findings, one of which has been known for a while, which is that a direct relationship between depression and mortality exists and persists over long periods of time. The other finding is less well known, as it's a more recent phenomenon, which is that within the period from 1990 to 2011, depression in women has led to an increased risk in their mortality, up to the same rate as it is in men. The researchers argue that this increased risk of mortality still exists in women after controlling for variables like education, alcohol use, and obesity, which implies that there's some other factor or factors working to increase mortality risk in depressed women, but that these have only been present or influential in the most recent decades. The researchers suggest that the rise in mortality risk for women suffering depression might be caused by a changing socioeconomic landscape that requires women to work longer hours at more jobs. To quote the researchers in the study, they say, "The changing roles of women in and outside of the home may have been a contributor to the increasing mortality burden of depression among working-age women, as they carried the responsibility for multiple roles." Ultimately, the researchers' findings suggest that people who care for depressed people, be they licensed medical professionals or simply the concerned friends and family of someone suffering depression, these people should be mindful of their recurrent depressive episodes, as mortality risk is highest when someone feels like they've been kicked when they're already down on the ground.